When you take a stop and look and see crazy things in this black history, across the ocean and across the seas, now is the time to be free.
Hello and welcome to AfRaKa, a Blak Mestory, part 2. This is where we're going to be continuing to dig down, trying to get behind the real story of how we got from our original position of magnificence, living naturally in a state of peace, love and relative prosperity, to our present position where even today we continue to struggle and strive for equal rights and justice in this modern world, which seems unable to accept that the black African person could also be capable of achieving developmental greatness. Before we continue to go through our Blak Mestory, I'd just like to quickly recap what we discussed in part 1. So you can see we have our umbrella tree again, and as you can see, there are 11 different sections or chapters that we are covering over the course of this program. And highlighted in red, you can see the 4 sections that we covered in part 1. From the first section, pre-300,000 BC, where we discussed the volatile and hazardous state of conditions on the planet at that time and the Homo erectus creatures that were around at that time. Followed by the section on first African inhabitants, where we looked at the dates relating to the earliest records of human presence around the different parts of Africa. We also suggested that the popular out of Africa hypothesis was an inaccurate retelling of African history, which becomes evident when you look at how the population started to spread around in Africa next to the human spread and the related dates as it ties to events in Europe and Asia. We looked at the nomadic lifestyles that developed in North Africa and how that had played a significant role in shaping the various types of deification that were being introduced into the people's daily rituals. And finally, we looked at beyond desiccation, when severe drying in the Sahara region ended the nomadic practices that had been developed, with a return to settled living that would be confined within enclosed and secure surroundings. We also begin to see the first signs of big nationalism during this period through the developments taking place in ancient Egypt, for example in the pyramids, and Kush, where you see major gold mining projects and exports. So before we get into our next section, where we will be looking at the first contacts made between Africans and non-Africans, for those of you who have a Christian sympathies or that kind of religious outlook, I'd just like to point out what might be described as parallels in our African Mestory so far, in line with the allegories and stories written in the Bible. So to begin with, we had the Genesis creation story relating to a time when the earth is still being prepared in readiness for the arrival of the humans, Adam and Eve. Interestingly, Dr. George James makes the following statement in relation to this in his 1954 book, Stolen Legacy. We also discussed how the earliest Africans were effectively multiple Adams and Eves remaining within the boundaries of their settled Garden of Eden societies for over 300,000 years. New forms of deification that came with the nomadic lifestyles that developed around 10,000 BCE and their related seasonal migratory practices, specifically in relation to the Apis bow, can easily be linked to the phrasing that appears in several books of the Bible's Old Testament. This verse from Numbers 14 verse 8 would stand as a good representation of the nomads' kind of expression of faith and dedication to their God figure as it relates to the Hebrews in the Bible story as they migrated out of Egypt into the land of Canaan as part of the Great Exodus event. The period of desiccation between the 5th and the 2nd millennium BCE would force the African nomads to return to a more settled way of life, following the way of the brave and proud lion deity as is portrayed by the construction of the Sphinx, which was built around the 8th millennium BCE at the height of nomadic activity in the Sahara region. The lion deity and its connected settled culture was positioned to directly contradict the nomads' culture and their Apis deity. This would be a battle in which the lion would eventually prevail, with the nomadic lifestyle in the Sahara being totally abandoned by the 2nd millennium BCE. There are several interesting references to a Lion of Judah in the Bible, which would align quite neatly with events in the North African Sahara region at this time. And here are two examples, one from the book of Genesis and the second from the book of Revelation. The clear symbolism that can be attached to these two aspects of the Bible stories are as can be seen here. The first is the migratory Exodus episode, which is linked to the bull culture, even including a scene that included a golden calf as the Hebrews embarked on their famous journey out of Egypt to a yet to be defined destination. And secondly, the later development of a settled and enclosed base by the Israelites at the city of David. It's undoubtedly aligned with the settled lion culture that had been originated in ancient Egypt and in Kush thousands of years before. The introduction of civil law systems within enclosed societies brought about the deification in ancient Egypt of the goddess Ma'at. She was the personification of the spirit of justice and clean living. Much of the Ten Commandments and other aspects of Moses' law in the Old Testament can be found within the 42 confirmations, commonly referred to as negative confessions, that are required within the Ma'at system of judgment. Something that can be by no means surprising considering the kind of initiation into the Egyptian education system that this particular prophet of the Bible would have had. Examples such as these give some insight into the kind of reverence and dedication that the Africans of that period that we have been discussing gave to their deities.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel.
Africa's first foreign contacts. In this section, we will be looking at the early contacts made between Africans and people from the other continents. We won't just be looking at it as a picture of early non-African presence on the continent, but we will also be looking at African presence in locations outside of the continent. One of the popular contemporary scientific theories suggests that some early Africans had begun migrating from the northeast into Asia from around 40,000 BCE, which, by the way, is about the same time as Neanderthals became extinct. Although there has been some evidence found pointing to the possibility of ancient African presence in Asia, stretching as far east as China, I haven't uncovered in this research any precise evidence of when they would have actually arrived in these locations. Before I get into what could possibly be described as solid findings with respect to the first foreign contacts made by and with Africans, I want to take a look at something that many would probably consider to be fanciful or unfounded speculation. This is in relation to the Mayan head statues, which are located in Mexico. So you can see the head statue here, which were found located in Mexico, and they were constructed during the middle of the second millennium BCE. What you'll probably notice straight away when you look at this image is that we are looking at the face of an African person. The strong features on display matched no other people more precisely. It reminds me of a quote from a French explorer called de Volney. This is from a book that he had written called Travels Through Syria and Egypt, after his party's first encounter with the Great Sphinx of Giza in the late 18th century CE. So I'll just take a look at that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel.
So if we take from this that the creators of these statues were Africans, it has to be accepted that early Africans had travelled by sea to the Americas at least during the second millennium BCE, if not earlier. So accepting that Africans did arrive in the Americas, the question is, from where? The first thing to look for when trying to identify such a location is evidence of the earliest ship or boat building activity and fishing in regions that connect to the African coast. There are actually 3 locations in our research that catch the eye, all of them being located on the west coast and having traditions that included a ship and boat building culture that predates the creation of the head statues in Mexico. Those 3 locations are Mauritania, Senegal, and Nigeria, the latter 2 showing evidence that predates these statues more than 4,000 years. The people from all of these communities will have had some aspects of ancestral and/or cultural connection to the former nomadic communities of the Sahara region, along with a strong possibility of meaningful contacts with the powerful big nation societies of Egypt and Kush in the east. The strongest candidate of the three would have to be Nigeria, where we see the establishment of a site with several circular step pyramids in southern Nigeria. So if we can see here, I think there was a total of 10 that was built. This photograph was actually taken in the 1930s. I think I can count about at least 4 in this photograph. And they were built in the 3rd millennium BCE, which matches up closely with the dating for the creation of the Step Pyramid, which was the first of the great pyramids that were built in Egypt. In addition to this, the Nigerian pyramids were built using a clay mud style of stone, very similar to the Kushite constructions of that period, suggesting the presence in that region of Kushite priests, masons, and nobles, eager to spread the spiritual beliefs which connected them to the lion culture that was being developed in the major eastern settlements. The building of pyramids of itself was a symbolic indication of a religious or spiritual belief in the afterlife. The erect structures pointing to the heavens were constructed in remembrance of the holy instrument, which was fabricated by the goddess Set for her husband, the god Asur, enabling him to propel the soul of the righteous prince, his son, Heru, or also known as Horus, son of God, into his reserved place in heaven, enabling him to assist in the crossing over of his most loyal followers. The burial site for a leader greatly revered for their righteousness and justice would be closely associated with these pyramids, their wisdom and godliness in life a confirmation of their ancestral line of heritage, which they perceived as being handed down straight from the gods. A strong faith in this spiritual belief structure would form the basis on which these Africans would be prepared to brave the long, untested journey across the Ethiopian Ocean, as the South Atlantic used to be called, to make it to land in the Americas, strongly indicating that it was these Africans that successfully made it to Mexico. Evidence of shipbuilding activity near the coast of Senegal, possibly dating before the 7th millennium BCE, and later development of similar practices further north in Mauritania, along with the construction of stone walls surrounded settlements towards the start of the 2nd millennium BCE, makes a reasonably strong case for either one of these two. Neither of these cases can be considered nearly as strong as the Nigerian example. The making of the Mayan head statues may have been intended to be a recreating of the head of the great Sphinx of Giza, which would have been largely covered in sand by that time, masking the original lion characteristics of that deity. Indeed, in the time of de Volney, when he had come across it in the late 18th century CE, the Common Era, only its head, carved in the image of the righteous prince of its day, was above surface level, and the Kushite masons leading on the Mayan construction project may have been, for this reason, guided by a slight misconception of the total characteristics of the Sphinx deity. Clues to the evidence of early African travel across the ocean can also be drawn from the mythical stories about by the ancient Greek philosopher Plato who wrote in 360 BC of a great noble called Solon, who had travelled to Egypt a few hundred years before and was told about a land which he calls Atlantis. It had been traditionally believed that Atlantis was located somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, which is where this body of water gets its modern day name from. Both with America having always been where it is, rather than suddenly appearing from beneath the sea when Christopher Columbus decided to take a look, it would have to be the only possible location for the place that was being spoken of in those ancient tales. The fact that the island ends up sinking beneath the sea is a strong indication that at least some of the Africans who travelled to the Americas also made it back to Africa. Looking back, as they sailed home, they would have seen as the land appeared to sink beneath sea level in the distant horizon, possibly crying in despair for the loved ones who they may have left behind. On the eastern side, there is some evidence of East Africans from Mozambique and South Africa sailing to Madagascar from as early as the 8th millennium BC, but it is presumed probable that this was solely for the purpose of food collection and needed resources, with no signs of actual settlement happening during this period. Also on the east, in the land of the ancient Egyptians, or shall I say in the land that the ancient Egyptians identified as its ancestral homeland, which they called Punt. And you can see an ancient carving, I think it's rock art, cave art, made in Egypt of the Punt sailors. Punt itself stretch from parts of modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia through to coastal territories of Eritrea, Djibouti and Somalia, as well as parts of Kenya. There have been found signs of off-continent contacts being made during the 3rd millennium BCE. The people of this land had started making the short trip from what is today Somalia across the Red Sea into modern-day Yemen during this period, making trading contacts with the Arabians who they found there, and even managing to build exchange relationships in the Near East. They traded in gold, frankincense, myrrh, and ebony, successfully continuing these practices into the 2nd millennium BC, and being able to stretch the range of their reach to markets in Eurasia and beyond into Greece. This largely because of its positive relationships with ancient Egypt, which was reaping the benefits of successful military campaigns into Kush and the Near East. The first significant settlements of non-Africans on the continent came within a couple of centuries of this, when people from Canaan began migrating into the region. They began settling and were allowed to start living independently of the Egyptian authorities in a small area towards the northeast, becoming known by Egyptologists as the 14th dynasty. It has been speculated in some circles that these people were the children of Israel from the Bible stories, but in this case there is no evidence of worship of a god of Abraham or of any other form of monotheism existing amongst them. Around the same time as when Africans were in Mexico constructing the Mayan statue heads, Africa was invaded by a foreign force for the first time. This was carried out by a Roman warrior people from the Near East regions known as Hyksos, who may have been operating using intelligence supplied by the Canaanite settlers in the northeast of the territory. They successfully invaded into northern Egypt, destroying many cities and temples and slaughtering many of its people. The Canaanite settlers in the northeast were very much left in peace. Their presence saw the first instance of Africans being taken away out of the continent into slavery. Their rule in northern Egypt would last for about 150 years before they were finally driven out in what is the closest reference to an Exodus event out of Egypt in recorded history as it relates to factuality in the Bible story. Again, as with the Canaanites before them, the Hyksos showed no sign of a faith in a God of Abraham or of Israel, or even of any form of monotheist practiced. Right at the end of the second millennium BCE, Phoenicians from modern-day Lebanon arrived on the Tunisian coast and would eventually establish Carthage there around 800 BCE, spreading their influence across most of the North African coast. A little more than a century later, around the start of the first millennium BCE, the kingdom of Damat, encompassing much of, if not all, of what was Punt, rose to prominence, managing to successfully colonize the kingdom of Saba in southern Arabia. That territory is a territory that was believed to be the land of Sheba mentioned in the Bible story of King Solomon. Towards the end of the 8th century BC, Kush had managed to take control over the whole of ancient Egypt, including parts of the Near East. They were unsuccessful in trying to invade into territory of the Assyrian Empire, who responded by driving Kush out of Egypt around 670 BCE. The first Greeks to arrive on the continent occurred around 630 BCE in Libya, where they founded a coastal region that they called Cyrenaica. This was the period that Plato's Solon character in two of his histories dialogues, which we mentioned earlier, was supposed to have visited Egypt. It would fall under Persian rule a century later, after they had invaded into Egypt, staying in power there for close to 200 years, before ancient Greece would come in and take over under Alexander the Greek in 330 BCE. During the 3rd century BCE, a seafaring people from Malaysia and Indonesia arrived in Madagascar. They had already begun settling on the islands around the Far East Pacific coast and had managed to make land at Madagascar, meeting and interacting with the East African population that they found there. Their people, together with their new African compatriots, would go on to sail across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, reaching Australia, New Zealand, as well as other Pacific islands such as Papua New Guinea, on their way to possibly even making it to South or Central America on its Pacific and West Coast side. In the north of the continent, what was the second naval war between Rome and Carthage took place around the 2nd century BC and would see the city of Carthage destroyed and the whole territory given the name the Roman province of Africa. The name Africa being connected to the indigenous name for a region within modern Tunisia, beginning what would become Roman dominance across the whole of the North Africa for the next few centuries. Going into the first century of the Common Era, India and Persian traders had begun arriving in Zanzibar and mainland Tanzania, their trading activities bringing resources from this region all the way into various Roman-controlled territories. So through our research into the first African foreign contacts, we've been able to show that Africans had started making significant off-continent contacts from the east during the 3rd millennium BCE. They were developing strong, though largely remote, trading contacts that would stretch out to Eurasia and Greece within 1,000 years. This is while on the west side Africans had departed, making that daring voyage across the Ethiopian Ocean to make land in Mexico. African relationships with Asians from the Near and Middle East were volatile and often hostile, particularly in relation to Egypt, Kush, and Punt, whilst relationships with Asians from further east, with their Southeast African contacts, seemed to be based primarily on trade and cooperation.
Yeah, I'm a rebel.
North Africa, 1st millennium BCE. By the start of the 1st millennium, desiccation in the Sahara region had virtually brought an end to the nomadic practices, seeing the establishment of settlements right across the north of the continent. Agricultural farming practices had become common, along with the domestication of cattle and also fishing in some places. Up until this point, significant non-African presence on the continent had been confined to northern Egypt, which had for a period of time been overrun by a nomadic warrior clan from the Near East called the Hyksos. If we look at the map here, we can see indicated by the blue dot the kind of the presence of the Hyksos is being indicated in the northern part of Egypt. Just before the start of the 1st millennium, Phoenicians, who were a sea warrior nation from modern day Lebanon, arrived at the most northerly peak of the African continent, which is located in modern day Tunisia, as indicated by the red dot on our map here. Their main interest was in obtaining metals which were otherwise hard for them to get hold of. They continued their trading there, eventually expanding their activities onto the coast of Libya within a century or so of their first arrival on the continent. The Phoenicians were forming treaties with the local Africans, who were referred to as Berbers, allowing them access to raw materials from their growing international trading activities. Significant numbers of indigenous Africans within the region had begun migrating out of the area into Egypt almost immediately, in line with the Phoenicians' arrival on these coastal territories, becoming known as the Meshwesh. They would eventually establish the 22nd dynasty of ancient Egypt and would be based in the northeast of that territory, forming their rule within 200 years. Their sudden migratory activity is a strong indication of Phoenician slave trading in the region, driving this movement of groups of people into Egypt, which is indicated on the map with the green arrow. Around 800 BCE, the Phoenicians established the coastal city of Carthage at their main base in Tunisia, as they began to develop trading settlements along the Mediterranean coast of Africa, reaching all the way across to Morocco. As you can see indicated on the map here again, the red dots, series of red dots running along the North African coast. Their dealings with the local Africans there in the west, who they called Maori or Westerners, saw them begin to acquire slaves from further south in modern-day Mauritania. These people, who had already developed a shipbuilding culture, were absorbed into the Phoenician and later Carthaginian shipping and military activities around the Mediterranean. Within a century, Carthage was operating independently of the Phoenicians, building on the trade and practices of their predecessor. The growing dual heritage nature of the Carthaginians allowed them to secure more meaningful contacts with the indigenous Africans that they dealt with on the north coast. In 630 BC, the first Europeans made it onto African soil, arriving on the coast at Libya, and that is indicated again on this map with the green dot. Okay. They were pre-Alexander Greeks, and they settled in a place which they would call Cyrenaica. It is here where they were introduced to the practice of ritual bathing, inspired by the Africans' deification of water, often referred to with goddess characteristics, encouraging cleanliness. The phrase cleanliness is next to godliness is drawn directly from this ideology. Towards the west, the indigenous ruler of Moharim, which is the western lands covering the mountainous range from Morocco to Algeria, would be mentioned in tales that would come out of ancient Greece. The king's name, according to those ancient tales, was Atlas, and the mountains covering his territory would be named after him, the Atlas Mountains. In those Greek tales, he is attributed with inventing the concept of a celestial sphere, recording the apparent position of the stars as they changed in the night sky, going through a rotational cycle in the heavens that would take 365 nights to be completed. So if we look at this early illustration of a celestial sphere, what it is probably one of the earliest illustrations that you'd find. It's certainly the earliest that I've found, and probably the closest to the African theory that it would have been drawn from originally. So what it is basically, it's like the gears on a bicycle wheel, expanding outwards from the middle. So, and in the middle, you've got the earth, and then we have 10 rows that expand outwards. The first 7 would be representing the planets within the solar system, and then the outer levels would be the stars and constellations in the more distant universe. Yeah, so the 7 planets in the solar system are referred to by days of the week, and a week being determined by the 4 moons that make up the different lunar phases in a monthly cycle. So the 4 different lunar phases would be the new moon, the waxing moon, the full moon, and the waning moon. The waxing moon, that would be a reference to the daytime kind of half moon, and the waning moon would be like the nighttime half moon. Okay, and it basically takes 7 days for each phase to be completed, and those 7 days would make up the concept of a week. So the week would start on the moon day, which is like in modern times we refer to as Monday, and like I said, with each movement of the week, so with each 7 days, we would move on to the next phase of the lunar cycle, and once the lunar cycle is completed, if we look at the outer layers, that would move on after each lunar cycle. So right at the top, you've got something that looks like a sign that looks like almost like a 69 figure. That would be a representation of certainly an early representation of the Pisces. You've got the Taurus ram, if you go around right at the top. So they're giving you an indication of the monthly cycles being measured by the position of the stars. Okay. After each of these constellations, the cycle would take, like I said, 365 days. It would take a full year for those cycles to be completed. The ancient Greek were that impressed with King Atlas of Moharim that they named a mythical god after him, and based it loosely around his character. As you can see in this image, we've got an image of their god Atlas, who appears like he's being cursed with having to carry the whole planet or all the world on his shoulders. Okay. Around that same time, mid 6th century BCE, or to late 6th century BCE, the Kushites, who had the century before been in control in Egypt, before being driven out by the Assyrian Empire, as you can see indicated by the light blue arrow pointing into Egypt, they had begun carving out a route across the Saharan region, across the desert, through Niger, to continue their trading with the Carthaginians, which had probably started to develop during the time that they had been in control in Egypt. What they were doing was trading right up to the north coast of Morocco, and they were trading in gold, ivory, and slaves. The Persian invasion of Egypt around 520 BC, indicated by the purple maroon coloured arrows, that brought them into Cyrenaica, where the largely Greek people there bowed without resistance to their authority. Persian rule was successfully maintained in these territories for over 200 years before Alexander the Greek invaded and conquered, being welcomed with open arms by his Greek compatriots in Cyrenaica. They would stay in place in Egypt and Cyrenaica for about 300 years, functioning independently of Greek rule, forming the Ptolemaic dynasty and adopting many aspects of the Egyptian culture for itself. the monarch for Cyrenaica would be drawn from the Ptolemaic royalty that was in place in Egypt. At this time, in Rome had still not arrived on African soil, with the Mediterranean being dominated by the Carthaginians. But a series of naval wars between the two powers, known as the Punic Wars, which the first of which started during the 3rd century BCE, would see Carthage's influence on the north coast significantly reduced. So we've got a map here of the 2nd century BCE, and we can see in yellow, the yellow dots indicating that the territories that were controlled by the Carthaginians have now been annexed by Rome. This happening towards the end of the 2nd century BCE, and the Romans would declare it as being the Roman province of Africa. AfRaKa, I think we mentioned in the previous section that AfRaKa was the name of was the indigenous name of one of the regions, a small region in Tunisia at that time. A third war in the middle of the 2nd century BCE would bring the Roman sacking and demolition of Carthage and the slaughter of most of its population. The other territories towards the west, known collectively as Numidia, benefited from greater independence as a reward for the support that their king, Macesen, had given Rome against Carthage. The rebellious actions of his grandson when he became king a few decades later would see him removed and replaced with the vassal king that the Romans had already put in place in the neighbouring province of AfRaKa before the whole territory was eventually annexed. With Rome also managing to take Egypt and Cyrenaica by the end of the 1st millennium BCE, the whole of North Africa from Egypt to Morocco was under the rule of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a rebel in the morning, rebel in the evening too. I'm a rebel. When you take a stop and look and see crazy things in this black history, across the ocean and across the seas, now is the time to be free. No commotion, I'm feeling the pain, I feel their emotion, the love and devotion, just like a root potion, 'cause I'm a rebel.